Hi, everybody. Okay, so I'll stay in the white box. There we go. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody. Thank you for having me, and look forward to the rest of the day. So I want to share some thoughts on the role of evidence in what I would call forced reimagining of foreign aid. Some of these are trends that were happening regardless, but obviously there's a bit of a reckoning that's taking place with a lot of thinking from around the world, not just the United States. I'm going to start by just telling you a slight personal story to help motivate one of the things that I often hear. So before I got my PhD, I was getting an MBA. I was applying to grad school, didn't know if I was going to get into a PhD program, so I was working on Plan B. I had an interview with an asset management firm. I asked a friend of mine, what do I need to know for that? And they said, oh, be prepared to pitch a stock. Pick a stock and tell them whether you would invest in it and why. So I went in this interview. They asked me exactly that question. And I told them, hey, my net worth between my wife and me is about $500. I don't spend time figuring out how to invest that. It just doesn't make any sense. I gave them here's my philosophy of what I would think about if I were in that job, but I don't have the resources to make that return on investment. One of the things now segueing to foreign aid, one of the things that I got used to being told to say, and I'll admit I said it, is, oh, we got to do more with less. So cost effectiveness evidence is going to be really important in the shrinking budgets that we're facing. So ask yourself, if a budget shrinks by 25%, is being cost effective more or less important? Implicitly what this is saying is, no, we got to be more cost effective now. Okay, now I'm going to ask you a slightly different question. If budget increases by 25%, is it more or less important that we are cost effective? Okay, so I'm putting aside the kind of call it corner solution in the sense of like we can actually solve a problem. If we can solve a problem, then what I'm saying is not right. But that's not the world we live in. There's no problem in the world that foreign aid is, quote, solving, okay? So we have doing more with less. We also might say, no, we have a bigger budget, we ought to do more with more. If you go back to my story, my story was doing more with more. It was not worth it to invest in information and thoughtfulness with a small budget. It was only worth it with a big budget, right? So this is very counter to some of the language that I keep being told to use, and I shy away from it. So how about just do the most we can with what we got? That's basically what we need to do. And that's true regardless of the budget, okay? Having said that, between us here and I guess maybe the internet, if it's useful and powerful to get people to pay attention to evidence, then I'm willing to just keep my mouth shut and say those lines. But between us, we'll just keep this critique as a secret, and I promise if budgets go up, I will be equally vocal for saying, my gosh, budgets are up. We really got to be effective with what we're doing now because the implication is that much more. So there's three broad pressures that we see happening in foreign aid. And I'm sure this list is longer, to be fair, but three that I'm going to name. First is we are seeing global budget crunches. That obviously is happening in the United States, and some of that is happening to other countries because of the US cutbacks in military support, for instance, to Ukraine, that leads some countries to doing more, shifting their budgets over to military from aid, such as we've seen in the UK. And some of the trend is just what I would refer to as localized populism. And the reason I add the word localized there, and this is actually not so different than some of the underlying trends that Tim was just talking about. And I say localized populism because obviously that's not populism global. That's not thinking about people. That's thinking about my people. And so there's so that's you localize populism, think of it as a euphemism for nationalism. Second is a trend towards more transactional foreign aid. I'm not going to go into this in detail, but the key problem, as I see it with this, is it turns things into a quid pro quo, where you get exactly the quo, nothing more, nothing less. Whereas instead, if you think about foreign aid as cooperation, the reality is think about it like a relationship. You don't write a contract with a partner, with a spouse, on every little detail in your life. That's a very dysfunctional marriage, right? And the same thing, if you want to have a partnership with another country, You can't possibly think that you're going to detail every single thing into a quid pro quo contract. You then only get exactly what you contract on, nothing more, nothing less. The third trend is a trend that has been increasing and growing on accountability. And it's exacerbated by abstract benefits. And what I mean by that is at two levels. One of the things that I often hear as a critique of foreign aid is, we gave a lot of money to country X because they were poor. Hey, look, they're still poor, so it must not have worked. That is really bad analytical analysis. That's just, right, that doesn't pay attention to what you changed. It doesn't pay attention to what we call the counterfactual. Where would the country be without that aid? And they might have been even more poor. It's the same basic flaw that takes place at the program level. It's the same fundamental analytical gap. If there's a training program, it trains people, and then they get a job, someone declares the program a success. If they don't, they declare it a failure. In both of those cases, that's bad analysis. That's bad use of data. We don't know what would have happened otherwise. We don't know that counterfactual. These are problems both at the global level when we think about aid writ large, and it's also a problem for individual programs. And yet, so that kind of, the accountability challenge is this struggle with people pushing for more impact, but at the same time, pushing for things that are bad analysis. Now, when we think about the national interest, which is often, when we see some of these trends taking place, it tends to revert back to national interest. And this is true regardless of the country, that we see some of this pressure taking place for some of the reasons just discussed. When we think about what benefits do we get, in the United States, Secretary Rubio spoke about foreign aid as needing to be in our national interest and defining it as satisfying one or more of three questions. Does it make America safer, more prosperous, and stronger? So when we think about the why of foreign aid, think about it breaking down, and I want to get back to what does it mean to be stronger? That's really where I want to leave you kind of paying most attention to. So first of all, we think about sometimes there's aid that has very direct and tangible benefits on safer and more prosperous. It might be, in the case of the United States, buying wheat from farmers in Kansas and sending it overseas. It might be about reducing the spread of infectious diseases. It might be about reducing civil war and refugee crises that end up on the shores of any country. And that's true regardless. That's true in Europe. All these things I've named are true of any kind of wealthy country and the direct benefits that might accrue. There's also indirect benefits that are tangible but a little bit more difficult to attribute. Global cooperation that comes from the UN votes, efforts to act collectively on climate, for instance, as we just heard about, on global public goods of knowledge, as well as refugees. But what does it mean to make us stronger? This one is not as clear, right? So, and to be clear, one of the things I often will hear is people naming stronger as more economically prosperous or safer, but the answer is no. Those are already taken care of by the safer, more prosperous. So what does it mean to be stronger? I would say, and I think this is consistent with some of the rhetoric we've heard from the beginning of USAID, from Secretary Rubio when he was Senator Rubio, a government is acting on behalf of its people. A lot of times we think of our people as being generous, and I say this we as in this applies to many countries. I've heard many political leaders refer to the generosity of our people. And you want a government who represents its people through the political process, but we want that government to be representing its people. And when you are strong, you are able to see past your nose and helping those around you, lifting everybody up, not just thinking about yourself. And that's what it means to be stronger. And if you take that principle, now you've let in generosity, full stop. Just pure altruism, helping others for the sake of helping them, full stop, becomes something that makes you stronger. Now, there's also a benefit of being a moral leader does then turn into other soft benefits in terms of global cooperation on things that are more tangible that you might want. So you could argue it either way. But that is what I would think of as making any country that is providing aid stronger. So role of evidence in all this. So now I'm going to do, in a sense, the complement of Tim's talk. I'm now going to become a little bit like a technocrat, although with one exception. We'll talk about at the end about how to do technocracy. You want to avoid the exact issue that we just heard about of the technocracy that is that kind of top-down, thou shalt, here's the global evidence, just go do this. And that's not what I'm talking about. But other than that, I'm now going to segue into a very technocratic aspect of accept the global trend and allocation of resources as is, and now how do you do the best you can with those resources to make the most good you can? So when we think about the role of evidence, one of the things that struck me when I first joined USAID, I went on what is best described as an acronym tour, where I had a meeting with a whole bunch of different groups, learning what they do and the acronym that underlies their group, right? It was very informative and very necessary because I had a lot to learn about USAID. And one of the things that struck me is as much inefficiency as there was also a lot of people there who were eager to see change happen, and there's no way we would have achieved what we did achieve had there not been those kinds of eager and smart minds ready to do things but not feeling empowered to have done it. Every single one of those meetings I had opened up, though, with telling me how they were evidence-based, partly because they probably read my bio in advance, right, understandably so, and knew that I was there to think about evidence. Now, when they said this, there's basically 4 different ways that we think about introducing evidence into the foreign aid process. There's the strategy level. Should we spend money on health or education? How much should we spend in this country? What are the main issues in this country? These are diagnostic. These actually are readily available resources to do that. You don't need to spend that much money or time on resetting those kinds of high-level strategies. There's design. This is where our emphasis was, our main emphasis at USAID. The design meaning you're going to spend $40 million on education in this country. What are you actually going to fund? And what is the evidence that's out there from the rest of the world that can help inform how to do the most good you can on education in Tanzania? And how are you going to contextualize that information and that evidence to the situation in that country? Because it isn't just a cookie cutter, to go to the point that Tim was saying. It's not just taking the global evidence from high and saying, there's your program to go do it. It's a combination of the evidence that we have from around the world, combined with contextual information in the country about how to implement and how to choose among the good ideas in a particular country. So that's the design work, and that's actually where our focus was in terms of the team that we built. The third is implementation. This is about using evidence in the actual implementation of aid. This is actually not really something for the donors that much. It's really more for the people you're funding. But there is a role there for evidence to help improve and manage the day-to-day workings of whatever it is that's being done. And the fourth, which is often where people assume we go, is the evaluation work. One of the things that surprised people the most within USAID is how often I argued against an impact evaluation. Because we would argue for impact evaluations when we didn't already have good information from the rest of the world about whether something was a good idea or not. I did not advocate for more randomized trials of medicine that had already passed all of the appropriate medical trials to know that it worked. Instead, we focused on, is it getting delivered right? Same thing on social services. We've seen at least 115 randomized trials of cash transfers. We did not argue for the 116th. Not needed. So with all that, I want to focus on 4, call them mantras or principles, for the how of foreign aid. The first is admit and optimize trade-offs. This is one of the hardest things that we had to operationalize, but one of the realities is when we had 10 people in a room deciding how to design an award that was going to spend $100 million on education in a country, you might see 10 different ideas done. If you're not thinking about trade-offs, what ended up happening, it's like everybody got 1/10 of the program and you saw 10 things done, all to a common goal. And the thing that was striking was each one of those 10 things might be a good idea, but they can't all be better than each other. And so that's ultimately what the role of the evidence was to help illuminate those trade-offs. Second is we have to actually be tough on ourselves as the evidence people, making sure that the collection of data and the collection of evidence is itself cost-effective. So that's where we often found ourselves arguing against doing an impact evaluation, because we felt like, what are we going to learn from this that we don't already know? And if the answer is not much, either because it's not a good setting for learning or because it's asking a question that we already have good answers to, that is money that could instead go to more program services. So that's unethical. Don't do that. Third is, and this goes back to those 4 uses, distinguishing using evidence from generating evidence. That distinction is not instinctual in many cases, and it's always clear when I'm in a conversation when that is not clear. And when it's not clear, then you know that there's a lot of lack of precision in both of them when they're getting muddled. And it's very helpful to really think about them very clearly. One is the planning moment and using the evidence that's out there to help decide what to do. And that was our key role at USAID, or one of the 2 main key roles, was that functionality. And the fourth, and this goes to the point about how to do technocracy without doing the flawed kind of top-down that can create problems, is realizing that the integration of evidence into the process of development is best done through a partnership with local government. That as big as we are as donors, even the USAID, which was the largest donor by dollars, not per capita, not as a percentage of income, but the largest in total dollars, is still tiny compared to local government. Okay, so go through each one in a little bit more detail, but I'm going to go quickly through this. On the first mantra, the key here is this is not just about addressing trade-offs across ideas and deciding what to fund, but there's also just an intensity issue that would often get ignored. And one of the things that I think is hardest for people is to think about the unreached people. A lot of times I would find myself in a conversation where there's a decision, for instance, I'll use a simple one, it's cash transfers. So you have to decide between giving $100 to 500,000 households or $50 to 1,000 households. Most times I would hear that conversation and I would have really strong advocates for the first and not the second. And the reason is because some people would have it in their mind that you have to get people to a certain level. There's like some sort of binary moment. You have to get there. And if you don't get there, then you don't have impact. And they ignore the unreached people. And so that leads to potentially misallocation. Now, taken to an extreme, I wouldn't say you go down to $1, but I think there's a tendency to put tremendous weight on the people in a program without paying attention to how many people are being reached. On being tough on ourselves, one of the things that's really clear is that doing bad evidence work not only is bad in that you are wasting money that could actually be used to help more people. But in the worst of the case, you're actually getting information in a bad way that then leads to future bad allocations. And so we have to be tough on ourselves too about thinking about what's the impact of the evidence work that we're doing, and is it itself cost effective? Is it worth spending the money on this? And are we doing it in a credible enough way that it actually should and could be used to allocate future decisions? The third, and this diagram is a diagram that we used within USAID, the team that we built, is distinguishing this using evidence from generating evidence. So this diagram on the right actually was a guide to both. And what we have here on the x-axis is the comparative cost effectiveness, and we would, in a given sector, we would create these 2x2s that helped identify different interventions and policies and where they belong in this spectrum. And so the more effective it was, the more likely it was to be in the goodbye or the promising. And the y-axis is basically another way of saying how much information do we have about this program, and so how confident are we of our ability to know in this particular context it's a good idea. So you might have some program that has lots of studies, and so it's more likely to be that we know more about it. It also could be that some programs are simply more varied by their very nature of the program, and so we have a harder time knowing in a new context, will it work or not. So both of those dimensions will affect where it is on the y-axis. And if something's in the bad buy or the good buy, then we're strictly in the use the evidence to make decisions world. We're not suggesting to do more evidence generation. Whereas if in the promising, unpromising world, now we're saying, now you have an obligation to also learn and to do evaluations to know, is this working, so that you can make better decisions in the future. The fourth point is that in foreign aid, even when you're big or small relative to the countries that we're working with, and that they're the ones with the bigger budgets. So how do we use aid not just to provide direct support and not just to directly influence people's lives for the better immediately with the program that is being funded, but how do we do it in a way that helps local government improve their policies in the long run? And so that means using evidence and generating evidence, working with local government, understanding where the gaps are for them, and doing that, that system strengthening work. So for that, a partnership is absolutely critical. Some of that is about looking at the global evidence, but then understanding how do you adapt that, contextualize it to run local policies, and how do you build that iterative process. So this is basically what we were doing with a focus on that second and fourth steps at USAID. By the time I left, we had shifted $1.7 billion. We had to first create the office. It didn't exist before. And we built a team up from a little over 30 in terms of number of people, from 1 to that. And we had shifted about $1.7 billion into more cost-effective programs. So we were pretty pleased with that. And frankly, a lot of that, what we were doing, was considered likely to be very popular in both sides of the aisle. Obviously, that's not the way things played out. Ironically, when the day one of the new administration came in power, they put out a directive to do a check on the programmatic efficiency of foreign aid. And when I first heard that phrase, programmatic efficiency, my thought was, okay, that's exactly what we're doing. How can I help get you that information? They used a different definition of that term, let's just say. So what can academics do? We are here at a university, so I do want to turn this back to us, because one of the things that was most striking to me, being on the donor side in that way, was yes, there were a lot of changes we need to make at USAID, but we weren't making it easy on them as academics. So here's a few different things that I see that we're lacking on the academic side that we need to do more of to help donors and local governments and wherever to use. The first is more aggregation of evidence. This means more data transparency, more club good harmonization. It's one thing to know that there's a whole bunch of studies out there studying something similar. You can learn so much more if you actually have a harmonized data set, putting it all together, being able to do that, but that's not not the way our club is organized, and we need to see more of that. And then also more reporting of cost data. I cannot tell you how striking it is, how differently we define the cost of something. Even we've done tremendously better. I look back at my early days, and you can see my papers, and I'm embarrassed to say you will not see cost in a lot of my early papers, and now you see them. And that's true of most people in the space. Right now, people think that no one's reporting cost. That's not true. Most papers report cost that I see, but they don't do it in a definitionally consistent way. And so we end up with these numbers that are radically different, and we don't quite understand why. So there's a lot more needs to be done to improve the reporting of costs. The second, which is a big space, is the contextualization implementation. So at USAID, if I handed a randomized trial published beautifully academically to someone who had to design a procurement to decide to spend money, there was a big disconnect between what that paper said and what they needed to know and put into a procurement. And some of this is on us as academics. We write papers based on a theory. So I'll give you one very simple example. We have a paper that we just released put together 3 different countries where we saw a particular social protection program run, comparing a group process to an individual process. 3 different countries, find the same exact result in the 3 countries. We put these 3 together. We have a nice paper that's all about the advantages or disadvantages of group versus individual implementation of social protection programs. We find no differences whatsoever. The entire paper is written about group versus individual. Yet if you were to take that paper, and want to write a procurement, all you would have is a little tiny paragraph of the other pieces of the program, because the entire paper is written about the part that we're writing about. So we need to have more implementation or contextualization guides that basically bridge what was written in the paper to what somebody who's actually going to do it, what are the things they need to figure out? What are the adaptable components of this? So, that's something that we need to do more of on the translation. And then lastly, we need more partnerships with the government. So here's just an example of the constraints that government face. And these are all things that we saw loud and clear in doing what we were doing. There's, first of all, inconsistent evidence to policy processes, often low staff capacity, poor data systems, some misaligned incentives, and lack of the relevant evidence. So these are all the problems you're facing. It's not as easy as just go to Google Scholar and expect everyone to adopt the ideas that are out there. So the process that we are a fan of, and this refers to the fourth mantra of that partnership, is an iterative process. And what we often refer to as evidence partnerships or embedded labs. They go by a few different names, but they're basically collaborations whose goal, first and foremost, is working with the government to help them use and develop better evidence so that they can improve their programs. And some of that stuff is academically interesting, and some of it is not. And so that's the key, is forming a partnership that basically gets the academic involved in the right way, but has its own life to it and an infrastructure to it, that it can do the parts that are, let's say, just less interesting from an academic perspective, because they're not leading to generalized knowledge, but they're absolutely necessary to do in order to help that country run a better Ministry of Education or whatever it is they need to do. So my last thought, in a fit of hopefully not irrational or ignorant optimism. We live in what often many people see today as dire and dour times. And I like to, I prefer to try to lay at night and think about this famous quote from Martin Luther King Jr., "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." I do think there's a lot of genuine desire to see the world in a better place, to see solutions addressed of these problems, and to care about each other in a way that allows us to take action and not just look for ourselves. Global market failures, like we're about to hear even more about in climate, are real, and we cannot solve these by working alone and within our own borders, as if that's the entirety of the problem is within our own border. So we do need more evidence, both to identify and quantify problems and to identify, plan, and implement solutions. But I'll stop by linking one thing back to what Tim was saying too. And just to be clear, yes, my talk here has been focused on the evidence as its role in this process. That is not you cannot solve these problems with evidence alone. Right? The politics and some of the collective action that we're about to hear about are all very much part of the overall process. And by no means would I ever want someone to think that I'm here to tell you that evidence and evidence alone is the answer. We have to also attack the institutions and the politics and the public opinion, and all these things factor in to then being able to run good policies and solve and try to address some of these issues that we all collectively face. So with that, I'll say thank you. Thank you very much.